Q. Yes. The work session of the Annapolis City Council for Thursday, April 14th, 2022 will be called to order at 2:02. At this time, please, would you join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Mr. City Attorney, please present the item on the agenda.
Yes, sir. The item on the agenda is presentations. ID 2422, Budget Overview and Review of the City Council Budget Binder.
All right, welcome. Who would like to take the lead?
I'll start. So,
Keep it down over there.
so the plan for today is similar to what we have done the last couple of years. We'll do sort of not a 10,000 foot, but maybe a 500 foot overview of the budget, a little more detailed than 10,000 feet. And then we'll run through the budget binders that you all have to show where the information is and what some of the important tables are in that. And then we'll talk about OpenGov a little bit to have some training on that, and then open it up for discussions.
So you'd like us to go through the presentation first and then open up for questions? Is that okay with everybody? We can just take notes as we go. We can roll back the slides to where you need to be.
I don't have a preference either way, but it'd probably be easier to get through the presentation and then try to circle back with questions. But if it's something of immediate concern, you can definitely interrupt me while I'm talking.
Thank you.
All right, so we have the slide presentation here. We've got, I wanted to talk first about what you have in your documents. I thought that would help before getting started with the presentation. So in your binder, you have the budget ordinance and the appendices to that ordinance, and that is the central part of the budget. That is the legal budget. It gives the spending authority for all departments and divisions and funds. And so all that you have other than that is a support to that ordinance, including a resolution that sets the fees for FY23, a resolution that sets the fines for FY23. Typically at this time you would have a pay plan resolution that establishes all the pay scales and new positions and a list of the positions that are authorized. But we don't have that yet because the union negotiations are still ongoing. So we hope to have that done before we're ready to deliberate final on the budget. But if that timing doesn't work out, we'll have to decide whether the pay plan that's existing stays in effect or how we deal with that delay and having a pay plan ready for July 1. All right, and so also in your binder, of course, you have a copy of the proposed FY23 operating budget and the proposed FY23 capital budget and capital improvement plan. Okay. So we started the presentation with an outlook for FY22. It's going to be a stronger year from a revenue perspective. We're projecting $89.7 million of revenue this year and $88.1 million of expenditures. And that's important. It's a surplus of $1.5 million. None of those revenues include the ARPA revenues that we thought we were going to need. So we were able to balance the budget with our own ongoing revenues and not tap any of those ARPA funds. All right. And so, and the last bullet there on that presentation is that we didn't have to tap the ARPA. All right, so then we move on to what we feel was the good news. 22. It's projected to the revenues are projected to beat our budget by 4.96 million. We don't have to use ARPA funds, we've said. Our recurring revenue is projected in 20 increased by 4.2 million over the projected for FY22. And this is primarily due to the growth in the property taxes, rec and parks fees, and ambulance fees. And state income taxes also came in very strong in 22. The occupancy tax revenue has grown significantly. And in 23, it's going to be at about $3 million. That's better than it was before we went into the pandemic. We feel a lot of that is due to compliance of product that we're using to find people that are not complying with our laws. We had, like I said, the state income tax is strong in FY22. And we project it to be $9 million in 23. I think in 22 that's going to be $10 million, but I'm not going to anticipate that coming in again in 23. We one-time disbursement by surprise in March that we weren't. So it was for calendar year 20. So I'm not anticipating that we'll have a distribution like that next spring. And again, the line of our general fund revenues are from property taxes. It's 66% to 67%. It's a stable percentage. And we are meeting our 15% unassigned general fund balance in accordance with. We have some challenges though. Our general fund revenue growth on the recurring side without ARPA continues to lag the growth in personnel costs, which is, we do have a structural deficit, the 23 proposed budget, to the amount of $1.5 million. One of the revenue sources that's plugged into this budget is 1.5 ARPA funding to close the gap between our projected expenses for next year and the ongoing revenue sources. We do project that we are going to need ARPA funding for both 23 and 24. The union negotiations are intended to be a 2-year contract, so that will get us through the 2 years, and then the properties are reassessed, and we'll know more on the new situation at that time. The yes. Okay, so the last bullet there is talking about the growth in the real estate tax, occupancy taxes, and income taxes. Hopefully will grow enough to eliminate this deficit. If not, council will have to determine how to address that. The ARPA funding is gone. In FY23 projection, the good news, healthcare costs are expected to increase in 20, but we do not think we're going to have to increase healthcare premiums, and we're not planning on it. As you know, for the last 3, you've been able to give premium holidays in the spring because the health insurance had accumulated revenues in excess, the revenues were in excess of the actual cost. But with healthcare increasing now, people are starting to go back to their doctors. There is an inflation factor on the regular claims expense. We feel the premiums are enough to cover 23 expenses, but we do not anticipate that at the end of 23 we'll to give another premium holiday. So going into 20, anticipate the healthcare premiums will likely have to increase. Another piece of good news is the pension costs for police and fire. They're in 23 compared to 22. The measurement was done as of June 30 of 2021, and the market had recovered at that time. And the percentage of salaries that they recommend 34.1% compared to 34.17%. So that's virtually a flat rate. We have some challenges. High inflation is one of our biggest challenges. There's a lot of competition for job candidates, and it's driving wages up in the region, and people are offering signing bonuses and all kinds of things to attract candidates to their workplaces. So we're in there, we're fighting for candidates and are currently having a hard time trying to recruit people. And benefits, they're about 70% of the total budget. They're growing at a faster rate than the general fund recurring revenue this time. And the state pension rates, we've been notified, are going to increase slightly. They're going up from 10.24% of salaries to 10.93% of salaries. Yes, they do give us that rate, Rob. All right, so we wanted to add in here that the budget includes your initiatives that we discussed at a previous meeting. A lot of funding going to APD. A lot of that will be in salary as well as non-salary initiatives. The council had stated that's one of their concerns going into these next years, be able to recruit and retain police officers, give them the resources they need. And zoning compliance inspector added to planning and zoning, which was another priority that the council discussed in our meeting, which I believe was in the This slide, I won't go down all the lines, but this shows you the breakdown, general fund revenues, 21 actual compared to the projected and the 23 proposed. So I won't go over any specifics now, but you may want to look at that and see if you have any questions on some of the changes. Yeah, well, charges for services, that's a lot of the Rec and Parks and the Harbor Master funding is improving significantly. The state pilot we get for police services, that's in there, that's growing as well. So it's a kind of a lot of different line items, but a lot of it's the Rec and Parks revenue. And on the intergovernmental side, that's the occupancy taxes and the income taxes. On parking and transportation revenues, there's the comparative analysis there. It's a little difficult to make any long-term projection because of the ups and downs we've been going through in the last couple of years with parking and transportation. You notice in 21, the parking fund had a very challenging revenue, $0.2 million. They were not able to give a subsidy to transportation, but the transportation fund had monies from their CARES Act money that came through the state and through their ARPA monies that they got. And we see in 22, the revenues have turned around. We weren't, they're well in what we anticipated with this $8.3 million projection. They're very strong. When we had initially set the budget, we had assumed that Hillman Garage would be down for half the year. And so because of its delayed, it's provided a lot of this extra revenue. As you see, 23, that goes down a bit. A drop from this year by because of the full closure of Hillman. We've did some increases in the other garages because some of this parking will be displaced, and we're going to do more of the street parking as well, so more revenue from that source. The transportation revenues, again, 21 was a year for them. We are improving in '22 and to use the rest of their CARES money this year and ARPA monies. And in '23, they have some significant coming in. There are 2 significant grants for capital that are coming in, just 2 electric buses. So that's in that growth there with 2. All right. So some of our revenues for 2023, we're in the second year of a 3-year tax. And we are expecting an increase of about $5 million over 22. And this remains about 60% of general fund revenue. It's actually 61% next year. Income taxes are numbers are tying out exactly. I'm taking a look at them from the 22. So is that? I'm not going to speak to that because I'm not numbers are coming from. But like I said, we had a budget in FY22 and we're exceeding the budget because of this recent tax distribution that we received. And it's going to get us to about $10 overall. It's the highest year we've had in our state income tax revenue source. But I'm anticipating that to go down near $9 million next year. Okay. The tourism and group activities, we expect to see continued recovery and the associated revenues. Occupancy taxes should be stronger. We're anticipating those to go to $3 million this next year. That includes admissions and amusement taxes. Those are also climbing as more events are taking place. Recreation, we've seen increases in our recreation revenues. The new swimming pool brought in all revenues than the old one. And the harbor master is doing really well too with the slip rentals and the mooring rentals. And they also have more dock space, a house acquisition, more space to charge out. On the liquor licenses, it's a little down compared to budget, but we see that being a steady source in '23. And on the permitting side, we're seeing some recover and giving about a 10% increase in '23 over 2. This next slide shows you the 21-2023 comparison on the expenditure side. Again, you may look at that later and ask questions. You see that there, the first one that jumps out at me is the non-allocated line item. That is a place where we have tucked funding to cover the union negotiations. There is a significant $3.7 million number in there. We don't know. It's our best estimate of what we might be putting into the pay based on what we know at this time. We're valuing it at $3.6 million, and we put that in finance non-allocated because we don't know which departments to take it to yet. You also, there's a significant increase in the police budget, and this is before we add funding to the police for the pay package negotiating. And that includes some increases in benefits, but also non-salary items in there as well. On the fire side, that's a pretty steady increase with previous years. They're continuing with the increased staffing levels on each shift. That's initiated during COVID. But they've been trying to maintain that, right, to continue to fund that staffing level next year. Requested that we keep that. Okay, I don't see any more notable increases there, but you may want to ask questions of the other departments as you take some time to look at this presentation. Okay, pie charts. Everybody likes pie charts, and here we've shown the general fund expenditure divided by department. As you can see, half of our money goes to public safety, at least half. OEM there. The next slide is a breakdown of our general fund expenditure by category. Again, we see the salary and benefits is the line that's increasing at the highest rate. Okay, we can go on. Another pie chart, the expenditures by type, showing you that we get 71.8% of our expenses are in the salary and benefits category. I will keep in mind that that category includes the money that the city pays for health care for the OPEB. It includes the city's contributions to OPEB. I felt that was better shown as a salary and benefit item than any of the other categories. So it's really something that benefits retirees, but it is a form of a benefit. So it's in that line item, and it makes it higher than it normally is, around 70%. So when we look at the expenditures, and I think that's supposed to be 2023, we had 70.8% of the general fund expense, salary and benefits. That's 70.3% in 22 and 71.8%. The year over growth in salary benefits, 9.1%, 21 to 22, and 14% from 22 to 23. And on the contractual services side, 3.5%, 21 to 22, and 8.5% to 23. So the FY23 general fund budget has general fund revenues totaling $95.4 million. $1.5 million of that is ARPA. That is a non-recurring source. So that 1.5 is the amount of the structural deficit we have built into the 23 budget. When you look at the general fund appropriations of $1 million, that includes $5,030,000 of time expenses that are coming out of both the capital reserve fund and our reserve for one-time uses. We have those reserves in order to use them for these types of things, and so we are pulling it out of the reserve and getting some extra items that are only one time in nature that should go into the next year. Our FY22 audit is completed. Again, we will analyze the funds that is in excess of our 15% reserve, and that excess split between 50% goes to the capital reserve fund. The other percent will be used to fill the budget stabilization fund cap, and the remainder of that half will go to the reserve uses. And in the budget book, and we'll show this in a minute, I'm predicting that we will have some excess at the end of 2 to put into the reserves. Okay, so we've kind of touched on this already. Police and fire Contributions are going from 34.17% of salaries to 34.1% of salaries. That's going to save about $15,000. It's such a small decrease. The state pension, 10.24 to 10.93, which will be about $192,000. So here is where I project the fund balances will be at the end of 22, considering my projections for revenues and expenses, and the total fund balance of this reflects the complete distribution of the excess. The reserve will be at 15% of the for general fund, parking fund, and transportation fund revenue, and that's about $16.6 million. And we will actually, the cap on the budget stabilization fund increases this year because they're going up, and that cap raises, so we're going to be able to put a little more into the budget stable fund. We haven't done that in a few years because it's been over the cap. And the capital reserve is projected to be at $5.6 million. The reserve for one-time use is $6.5. And here is a slide where it runs you through that calculation. We have the budgeted revenue for 23 for the general fund, the parking fund, and transportation fund. That's $111 million. We are required to keep 15% of that in unreserved fund balance. That's the $16.6 that we spoke of. And I'm projecting, before we distribute the excess, that we'll have $18.5 million in total fund balance. And then the lines below show you that excess of $2.8 million being distributed to the three different reserves. Okay, so we run here through parking funds. In FY21, the revenues in the parking fund were 1.5 less than budgeted, and therefore we were not able to give a subsidy to transportation. And as I mentioned before, they used some ARPA and CARES funding in lieu of that subsidy. The costs in that fund were lower than budget by about $2.6 million. Due mainly to SP Plus savings and when the garages were down, they were lowering their staffing levels to match, to help us save some expenses. By 22, the budget assumed Hillman was online for half the year, but the projected revenues now are $2.3 million over, due mainly to the longer operational period for him and increased usage. And this, at the end of this year, we're going to send $860,000 to transportation as a subsidy that we had budgeted in 22 to go. And any amount in excess, which I'm estimating now will be $2.5 million, we're going to leave it in the fund because we have some changes coming up this year with parking fundation, and I want to keep that fund balance there. So until we see how the new arrangement with the P3 water revenues will be coming in and supporting the transportation system. And transportation still has some ARPA funding to use, so they're going to be in need of more parking fund monies in 23. On the transportation fund side, in 20 revenues, $491,000 less than their original budget. ARPA funds of 1.172 and TRAN funds of 1.3 million were used in place of the subsidy that they would have gotten from the fund. And I think we've talked, $2.1 million less than the original budget, and that was mainly due to the services during the pandemic, and the fuel costs were low time as well. In 22, projected at are projected at 6.2, and as I mentioned, may leave the fund with some excess at the end of the year. We're hoping to retain and see if we need that to help transportation over the next year or two. The parking fund subsidy 860, we talked about that, and that they still have some ARPA monies to use in 23, and they're going to deplete their CARES money this year. Moving on to the enterprise funds, I have here that talks about the fee increases. All of these are based on Stantec studies that look at the projected cost, how much working capital reserve each of these funds has, and how we can set rates to go up steadily over time and on any available reserve balances. At one of these presentations, Stantec is coming in to do a presentation to show some of the results of their studies. So we're not increasing them this year again. This is the third year we haven't had to increase the rates. The water rates are going up by 4%. And watershed rates going up by 7%. Solid waste rate is increasing by 8%. And we had Stantec do a calculation of looks like on a residential quarterly bill. And you see there 32 to 242, or about 4.3%. I had Katie insert this into the budget book this year. There's a page in the DPW section that has this information there. So you can look at it if you want. On the CIP funding, we have FY23 projects general fund side that total $62.6 million. That's higher. As you can see, we've got the whole city dock project in there, 23. So that's increased substantially. The funding source, you see, there's bonds of $4.5 million, some bonds from the enterprise fund of $367. Those are related to this facility that's being built. Pay-go from the enterprise fund, a lot of grants, and that, the significant piece of that is on city dock, both of the city dock projects that that are CIP make up most of the grant money. And the Cars Beach purchase is in there as well. That's another significant grant. We have pay-go coming in from the capital fund, $2.2 million. And another significant funding source for City Dock is a projected concession payment of the $22.2 million. Our enterprise funds total about $10 million. That's a pretty typical size for enterprise funds. Bonds and pay-go make up a significant amount of those, and they have a small amount of $400,000. All right, so here's we've got a couple of slides that talk about the timeline, just to remind the council on when we plan to address all of our budget issues. We've already introduced the budget on the 11th, and we are today on the 14th. Next starts the Finance Committee meetings, Monday through Thursday, for 2 weeks, from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock every day, Monday of both weeks, where the departments are going to make their presentation, and then you can have a chance to ask about each department's budgets and on the 28th, we're going to have, that's a Thursday, we're going to have a work session CIP and do a debt affordability presentation. Deb's going to come in and present their affordability model. So we've highlighted on the 9th, the Finance Committee is to have their finished report to the city council. And on May 16th is an important date, which is why we've bolded it, the due date for proposed budget amendments for the council to get them to the finance office so we can start drafting them up. Did you point them out, the highlight there on them? And it's for everybody's sake too, because it's an important day, and you'll have to, it's within a couple weeks of the final finance committee report and within a couple weeks of the presentation. So it's not a lot of time to gather up your initiatives. May 26th, I have a work session and discuss the amendments that have been submitted. 6th is our big day-long meeting where we consider the amendments and take votes. And then hopefully, if that goes well, on the 13th, we have the final of the budget. Just this last slide just has the dates when each of the departments are presented. Just a reference point for you. So, okay, so yeah, and so we can move ahead with questions. Again, Katie's ready to do a demonstration, get to the OpenGov link and book and some of the features if anybody needs a refresher on how to do that. But we can do it when you're ready.
So I think we'll do some questions first, but first of all, we want to thank you and Katie for a tremendous effort. These guys have worked 12-hour back shifts.
Yeah.
Katie has worked through COVID, and she's been hit hard. She's double vaxxed and boosted and everything like that. So I know you guys are so hard. We truly appreciate everything you've done to pull this together.
This year. It seems like it's harder every year, but it gets done faster every year. So I don't know why it feels that way. And I've had 2 presentations today, so I've been talking for most of it. If my voice starts to crack, you'll know why.
Thank you. Alderman Finlayson?
I had other questions, but the question I have right now is about the budgeting for April 18th through May 5th. It says finance budget hearings. And I was just posed that question. Is Aaron to take public testimony during our meetings? Traditionally, it's the council's opportunity to hear from department heads and ask them questions. If we're not opening it up, I would think we would change that term from budget hearings to budget deliberation for the finance committee, because that's really what it's supposed to be.
Manager? No.
I think it's up to the finance if you want to take public hearing or not. No. Okay.
We'll have public hearings on the budget. It's not like we're cutting the community out.
Right. As a full council.
At the full council, yeah.
So you're comfortable with us just changing deliberations? Because several times that's been said, and I don't want the public to feel like they're being left out because we're not taking public testimony.
Just to find out at City Council for the public to know that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, people can listen and pay attention, you know.
Yeah. I would also like to mention the public hearing that we have for the budget itself. There's a public hearing for constant yield. It's usually, I think, the second meeting in May. We have to advertise that early May, and then we have a hearing the second meeting of May, which is another opportunity for the public to come and comment on the budget.
Sorry, if you want to turn your microphone on. Attorney, was a question for Mr. City Manager? Yeah.
Just a clarification, that is on an executed resolution that the council signed unanimously, so I was just concerned about the wordage, and I didn't know if Mr. Job in front of him or not, the resolution, if we use the word hearing or not.
I will pull it up.
May I ask, do we need a resolution to set our agenda?
We did. We
already did it.
already
I
did
was
that.
just going to look at the language resolution that was passed last fall, I guess, late last year.
That.
But it's not for us to set our agenda.
No, I was just questioning the word used on the executed resolution.
Okay.
Other budget questions? Gentlemen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Director Dickinson, for this wonderful presentation. I just have two questions. The first one is, does any of what you presented to us include some potential federal infrastructure dollars from the recently passed infrastructure bill?
Not that I know of. I don't know about some of the feds that we're getting. One from the state for city. There's some other federal grants that are coming in for projects. I don't know if any of those are yet made it through new infrastructure bill.
I think, Alderman Gentleman, that some of them we say are funded, and we're making some assumptions that some of that money is going to come from federal dollars. Is that?
It could be. Sometimes the money feeds through the state to us, so I'm not sure about that. It would be on the capital project side.
Right, and I'm not aware any of those dollars have actually been sent out yet. So they're starting the app processes, and we're positioning ourselves to apply for those. I don't think they granted any of that yet.
We'll have our hands out when they're ready.
Awesome. That's what I like to hear. Two more questions, if you don't mind. I noticed that the public budget went down a little bit from the presentation from last year. If you go to the slides comparing last fiscal year to slide 13. Yeah. Wait, nope, I got that wrong. Thank you.
Slide 11.
Yes.
Public Works. 8, 7. Yeah, in 22, I think that there were some savings in that department because of facility savings, and there's also some turnovers too from vacancies. Katie, do you know any more details than that? I think. And there were some positions that we split between the public funds. Some positions are split between the general fund and the enterprise fund. And we had more salaries move out of the general fund than into the enterprise funds, just based on their job duties. But we had a significant amount of savings there from turnover and the facilities. Remember, most people were working from home. 21 and into 22, not as much in 22 as 21, so we had some savings there as well.
Excellent. And final question that I have is, I CC'd you on some emails about this about a month ago for another project that I had proposed.
Economic gardening?
Different one than that one,
Oh, okay.
but that one's coming more. This one was an actual study on the value of the land, that how financially productive, both in revenue that we get from it and expenditures that we. This was the Urban 3
Okay.
consultants. Have we ever done anything before I try to work my way as that as an event?
Yeah, not that I know of. I haven't been here for 4 years yet. I will say we're in an interesting area because 20% of our property value is non-taxable. The presence of the Navy and the state and the county and the city all within our city limits. So we have a lot of tax-exempt property, and it impacts our ability to raise new property tax levels.
And for my colleagues, what I'm referencing, there are some consultants, one of them being Urban 3, and I'll share this information with you later if you're interested. It essentially breaks down by property the amount of revenue that we get from those properties, along with the expense that we put on those properties, so we can see where we are hemorrhaging money and where we're making money, all the way down to individual lot size. So I believe that since we consistently have structural deficits, this is something very much worth looking at. Thank you.
Anything on that?
Oh, okay, thank you. And thank you for your fiscally sound estimate last year. That was really excellent. First question, Mr. Mayor, happy with the budget? Are your policies in it? Do you like it?
I'm happy that we got some experts doing it.
But your, you know, your policies about electric, all that,
Yeah, I
are
think
addressed, and
it's the direction we're all heading. I think done an excellent job to sort of include as much, and then I'm looking forward to evolving it with you.
okay, that's good. So just actual deficit, as I understand it, is when recurring revenues are not sufficient to support recurring expenses. And what I'm hearing is that without the ARP, which we were very fortunate to have, which is not a recurring expense,
Correct.
we did have a quote-unquote structural deficit.
Yes, and in '23, it's $1 million.
Okay, so do we know what's that deficit? You know, will natural growth post-pandemic help this? Or is this an ongoing significant delta of something growing faster than general revenue?
So that's a complicated question. It's probably both, that we have expenses, benefits that tend to climb with since I got here, we had a 4-year union contracts to honor. And these that we provide in our step scales are 5.3% between steps, but not everybody gets those. You get them, if you get in levels, you don't get them every year. And so on average, like our salaries and benefits are growing faster than the revenue. Some of that is flattening out now that the pension contribution rates are flattening out. We had significant that in the last 4 years, because beginning in 19, we decided to make the full actuarial recommended contribution, and that percentage of salaries grew every year, and some years substantial amount, to try to catch up with getting up to the actuarial recommendation and implementing new actuarial assumptions, the new assumption study. And the actuary had a 2-year phase-in of those new assumptions. And so now we're at the 4% level, and unless there's, except for majors in the investment markets, that should be steady. But the investment markets do tend to drive that percent too, so, you know, it could go up depending.
And this is assuming the revenue, the recurring revenue is
So what I'm saying is we had some significant growth the last 4 years for a couple contracts and those pension rates climbing. If though now we may see that the salary and benefit increase level off a bit, and then our revenue pick back up to a high growth rate, keep pace. It's hard to predict that when we've had 3 fiscal years of interruption. It affected FY 2022, the pandemic slowdown did, so it's hard to see where that's going to go in the future. We do the current union negotiation. It's a high inflation environment, and we're going to, you know, the packages are going to have to include some cost of living adjustment when inflation is so high. So in order to be competitive, we're going to have to make some provide some increases to employees, and we'll see what's up at the end of the negotiations, how high the rates are, what the is for the next 2 years, and then we can decide where we think the revenues are going to be 2 years beyond those 2-year time frame, and whether or not there's going to have to be an action by council to either locate other revenue sources or trim expenses in some way.
I mean, I'm assuming this is going to be an issue in fiscal year 2025 and
25. The ARPA monies have to be used before December of 2024, so it would take us halfway through 2025 if we still had some of those funds remaining.
Okay. Did you want
Give me a way in. So structural deficit clearly is a point in time issue, right? Because right as we don't have a structural deficit, in fact, we're going to have a surplus. So that's the good news for this year. So projections for next year, both revenue and expenses, we're expecting a 1.5 million. We budget in a very conservative way. And that's why it's nice to see ARPA there to support revenues if we need it. Because for whatever reason, expenses may increase. We know with inflation that costs are going up, and we know that labor costs are going up. So that's why we really want to protect the funding as revenue replacement. But as of today, we don't have a structural deficit. That's the good news picture, but we are projecting one for next year.
Right. I just want to clear that term. And my last question is adhering to the fiscal policy. Just so I understand, would it be an accurate statement to say the use of the fund balances and reserve limited to non-recurring expenses?
Yes, so capital reserve fund can only be used for capital improvements. Those in nature are one time. We don't have to continue to fund capital projects with it. We could stop at funding if we needed to. The other reserve, we call it a reserve. It's called the reserve for one-time use. That's what it's called in the code. That's where the policy, that's where the rest of that money gets limited to things that are one-time only.
Mm-hmm. And you're very happy with the fund balance estimates, I'm sure, because you did such a good job here.
Well, and again, my projections for 22, we try to be conservative even now in the spring because we want to, as if the departments are going to spend most of their budget. And so at the end of the year, typically there's a little bit more left over than even I project will be left over. But they have the option, every bit of their budget if they want to, or encumber it in a purchase order before you.
Thank you. Thank you again for your hard work in the pie charts.
There's more pie charts coming.
I know.
Alderman Annette.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Finance Department. Along with this morning's presentation to the fact, pretty encouraging stuff. In fact, so much I'd like to move to suspend the rules 15, 20. Brooks, Joe Budge and I did some analysis that we ought to talk about because maybe it can dovetail with what you're looking at. I do want to return to slide 6, and it is consistent, your slide 11 from this morning, and it is something that has long perplexed me. It's very similar to the kinds of questions Alderman was asking. Before all the interruptions of COVID, it's been the case, in my observation and our time series data, salaries and benefits were growing faster than our property taxes. Property taxes, after the big boom, seemed to settle down, and they would grow about 9 or 10% over the 3-year period. And but yet, and again, with these budgets, everything seems to balance out, and I just cannot figure out.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is when you budget something, you're saying all these are going to be full all year, and they're going to be paid at a certain rate. And when it comes to reality, the positions are vacant for part of the year, and you don't carry through with all of your plans. You don't hire as fast as you want to. People leave that you're leaving. So what you actually end up spending for the salaries and benefits lower than what you budget. We do try to budget a turnover in everybody's budget, but typically I think we've seen a lot of savings beyond even budgeted for turnover, especially in the police department. They have a certain amount of turnover, even in excess of what we put in their budget. So
It would be the police, I think, is probably the biggest example, an approximation. Is that like $1 million, $1.5 million, where we budget for the 124, but we really only have around 100? Do we have we can look it up. You don't have to answer it now, but it does seem like that's the biggest source of
I know that the budget in the past years have been just south of $1 million of turnover budgeted in there. I'm not sure how many positions that they typically have had over the past couple of years, between 10 and 12 vacant at any given time. Not that they're not trying to hire, but that's just their vacancy rate. You know, I think they're hoping that if we can structure the pay plan, we can attract to fill those positions.
So it seems like, since we're being very good harbingers of our ARPA monies and so forth, it not only sounds like 23 is looking good, it sounds like we're going to be pretty well healed for 24 as well. We'll have some reserves.
We'll have some reserves. I anticipate, well, we'll have to wait until the negotiated agreements come out because it's a 2-year thing, and then we can think we'll be through 24, and how much if our revenues are going to grow to meet those needs. But that is mainly, we know if things go as projected, we have funds to rely on for the next 2.5 years. And without those, though, if the salaries keep growing, the account to come up with another revenue source to cover them. By either
so that is my typical annual henny penny. The sky is falling.
Well,
sounds like it won't fall till 25.
Another factor that's been in our favor is continue to surprise us. Some of them, we've had some issues with income tax is very unpredictable. We've had years where it's much lower than anticipated, and then in other years it'd be way more than we anticipated. So that's a hard thing to estimate. But in all the years we've been very conservative with what we're estimating for revenue. So that helps with that year-end picture, talking about why is it that we think our revenues aren't growing enough for, so we end up making it work at the end. It's on both parts. Estimates of revenues and then expenditures coming in under anticipate.
Thank you, Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the finance team. And congratulations that we have a balanced budget. I guess we have to, but still, I liked what I saw. So just some questions here. So it was already mentioned, I think, by Alderman Meyer about the public works kind of not seeing as much of an increase. And I know I brought this up in years past about the difference between the growth in fire and police and how quickly that has been growing the past few years. In terms, and I know part of that's attributed to pensions, and a lot of it is. And so maybe I'll just send some questions to the finance committee about this. I've brought it up in the past. I'm not quite sure what the solution is. I mean, it's good to see that pensions are kind of leveling off in terms of our expenses, but we're still seeing quite a significant increase. And normally, I guess that a certain amount of that's to be expected, but in this case, because of the underlying deficit, it seems like we're going to have some issues. And yeah, it would be nice to dive on that underlying structural deficit at some point. Maybe it'd be more appropriate to come from the finance committee at some point. I don't know if it necessarily has to happen during this budget, but it'd be good to talk about steps we could take to, I mean, it seems like typically, what's going to happen is we're going to have a year where we run out of the ARPA funds and we're going to have to face this head on. And maybe we'll have to wait till then. Maybe that works, but I feel like we should be maybe looking to some proactive steps. And I mean, one of the alternatives, we're going to hit that wall is obviously how do we cut salary costs, but also do we want to look at periodic smaller property tax increase? I mean, those are really the only two alternatives, really, right?
Or find an alternative revenue source
Right.
that could come into us to help support activities, or search for more larger permanent operating grants, that type of thing. And our one of the things that's it's hard to quantify, but our departments are very at finding operating grants to help support their activities. And if that happens, some of their expenses get transferred to the grant. Some of the reasons why we're seeing these savings. You know, and we can talk about new revenue sources. I think I've mentioned the ambulance billing revenue from Medicaid. We're using a new method now, which is going to result in at least $1 million more of revenue. And if fire initiated that. Oh, I know, isn't that great? That's the best part of the presentation. And Katie's trying to get that off there, but it's like. Yeah.
But those are all good ideas, and at some point I think it'd be good to have a discussion, be it either session or finance committee.
If I can get a little perspective on the budget deficit. So the fund budget is about $90 million, 90 million, and we're projecting a $1 million budget deficit. And remember that those are based on, so that's less than 1%, really. I guess it's a little more than 1%, actually. Probably 1.2 or 1.3%, but still it's almost negligible what our budget deficit is based on a $90 million budget. So, you know, I think we're concerned about it, and we'd like to project a surplus every year, but it's pretty small in the big scheme of things.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I'd like to see, kind of, if you want to put together a different kind of chart, would be the line graph showing the revenues over the past few years, and including projected as well as the expenses over the past few years, just to see what the trends are. Because it looks, a quick look from the presentation, that the expenses are still growing more quickly than the revenue stream.
Yeah, as we establish the budget every year and we see the cost adjustments and the steps we're giving, theoretically looks higher than what we're bringing in. But like I said, the conservative budgets on the revenue side, conservative spending estimates always end up a little bit better. And the difference has been in the last couple of years, that difference is so small that those two things together are it. But again, it's ARPA and CARES money that these last 2 years have had to cover anything that we would have been short. So when we know we're going to run out of it someday. It's a good plan for what you're going to do on the revenue side. Either you accept that the property tax rate would incrementally every so often, or that you want to cut expenses or some way.
So something I know we've done in previous budgets with positions that they're funded, but then they're not filled, and so the allocated money gets, I forget what the term we were using, moved elsewhere. I know we were doing that with some of the police department positions in the past, weren't able to fill them all. So is that being any of the positions this year, or are they all just being held essentially open to be filled?
They're not being open. We're trying to fill every position we have. Police is having trouble getting candidates to fill those positions. And what you're talking about is our turnover vacancy factor. And if you added up the funding that we calculate what it's going to fill all 113 police officer positions, and I'm looking at the union membership there. And we count that, but we know they won't fill them. So when we set the budget, we don't set it to that total, take a little sum off. And with police, we have taken a few $100,000 off every year. They have vacancies. And what's happened is they have even more vacancies than we allow, and there's additional savings there. and in the past, we have transferred it to use for other purposes. So that, if that's what you're with your example there.
Okay, so there won't be any positions that are, so to speak, they're all going to be.
No.
Able
No,
to
we're
be
not
filled
planning on any positions.
Okay, and slide 21, if you, yeah, there you go. Question about that, about the transit. So on so in the second bullet, it said ARPA money is being used in place of anything. But then later on, so that's just, okay, so that's just for transit, because the last bullet says, we're actually,
Yeah,
we're not.
so-
One of them I thought said that there was, well, parking fund, it says parking fund subsidy projected.
So see that word subsidy, it's all referring to the same subsidy. It's money that's going from the parking to the transportation fund. Before the pandemic, it was somewhere, annually, it was between $2.5 to $3 million that the parking fund was sending over to help with transitions. When the pandemic hit, the last quarter of fiscal year, parking revenues were, they're very low, almost non-existent. Nobody was out, nobody was parking. So we had budgeted a certain level in 20 to send from park transportation, but we had to lower that a bit because there wasn't enough parking to send it over. And we determined that at the end of the year, once we know the parking fund revenue over expenses is calculated at. We calculate how much we can send in that subsidy. In 21, also, the parking fund had a short, lower revenues than we thought, and there wasn't any excess left to send over to transportation. So fortunately, we had our that had come in last spring. We used 1.1 million of that to help transportation activities, and the transportation department had received its own transit cares funding that could be used for operational costs. The CARES Act, first, they didn't want the transportation system to shut down because of the pandemic, so they gave these large transit grants for operations to maintain local operations. So they were able to use some of that money. That's in that second bullet. They used 1 point of the transit cares funds to get through 21, along with that $1 million we gave them. And then and so we talk about the expenses, and they were able to save some, but they still needed the 1.1 and 3 to break even. So that's what we try to do for transportation, find them revenue sources, their expenses for the year. And in 22, it looks, I had budget, when we set the budget, we anticipated we'd be able to send a subsidy this year of $860,000 from parking, assuming that the parking garage would close halfway through the year. And since it hasn't, there's more there. But instead of sending more to transportation this year, we're planning on keeping that in the parking fund.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Gay, and then Alderman Finlayson.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you as well to the finance team. This has been great. Through this and seeing some of the things that you all put together. I'm looking forward to it as well. I'm the old saying, a firm believer in a budget should reflect the priorities of your constituency, in particular our most vulnerable populations, and so to having those discussions as we move forward. I had a couple of quick questions. The first being, I requested a couple of weeks ago, and I'm wondering if it's here in this book at all, down of the AARP funding and CARES funding that we've received.
So When you say it down, what do you mean? Like what
Like
is
line
being
by
used?
line of how we've used every dollar CARES or American Rescue Plan money.
Okay, those are available already in quarterly reports that we sent the county for how we used the county gave us 4.9 million CARES money. At least 100,000 of that was by Laura Gutierrez and her community outreach team. And we were giving quarterly reports to the county all through that time frame as far as what we were using it for, and it's line item by line item. It'll say it was used for this vendor, for this purpose. So I provide you again with those quarterly reports. We did copy council when we issued those.
That's great. I do remember.
yeah.
I don't
So-
remember a couple, but I remember you sending those in the beginning. Definitely.
Yeah, so the ARPA funds, last spring, we found out that we were awarded directly $7.6 million. They sent half of that here in cash. The other half is supposed to be here this spring. And of that 3.6 or so, that's the half that we received, we used 1.1 million of it for Transit X to help the Transportation Fund continue services in fiscal year 21. Besides that, we had anticipated that FY2 would need $3 million of that money to pay for operating expenses. But we did not need that $3 million. So now ARPA, we have $6.5 million remaining of the ARPA funds.
So $6.5 million, and $6.5 million. Are you planning to use as it here? And I just want to be able to follow the use of that funding, because I think it's important. It's flexible. Say we have to use it for to supplement the FY 2023 budget, but
Right.
we could.
Right.
And so, but the use of the 6 million, 2.8 or 2,805,300 of that to for the 2023.
No, for 23 operations, we're planning on using 1.5.
Okay. I'm looking at page 112 under fiscal year 2023 budget. And the yeah, and the front half. It's the very last page, 112. Just before the tab
So
C.
that's in transportation, right?
Yes.
So transportation has been getting their own and their own ARPA monies.
Okay, perfect.
Directly from MDOT through the state. And that is more limited than ours is.
Okay.
It's definitely has to be used for transportation activities. Much of it can be used for any additional expense that they want to use it for.
Awesome.
But it does have to be related.
Okay. And then on page 6 in the very front, at the beginning of 015-22, how can I find section, it says section 23 and then the dot, how can I find that in the budget book?
Okay, so tell me again what page on what you're,
This is page 6, actually in the ordinance, 012.
and you're looking for what?
On page,
I got page 6 here.
there's a tab